of attention and accolades, including today for his great role in bringing consciousness around the issue of climate. I want to say that when I was growing up, we never called it climate, it was always environment. And, but I remember that religion was always a part of this conversation, and his value system, his belief system, his faith, and his deep desire to engage faith leaders was always a part of this for him. He has indeed written some bestsellers and won some prizes, and I must say, though, that the most impressive thing about my father is how he has handled adversity and challenge and disappointment, and I am so deeply moved watching him do that, and I feel that it's because at heart, he is a servant. He serves. He serves his people, he serves his country, and I think we can all say now, whatever the word used to be, he serves Mother Earth. Thank you, Dad, for being here.
You can just barely imagine how proud of Karenna I am, how much I love her. And Oren, you talked about her picking up my work. Honestly, I have learned so many insights from Karenna that I never would have found accessible to me except for her. And that's been going on for quite a long time, but all the more so here at this Center for Earth Ethics, Karenna, and to you and your so I'm very, very admiring of what you're doing here. And to you and your colleagues at Union, congratulations and thank you. I'll come back to that, but I first want to pay my respects to my fellow panelists, starting with Chief Oren Lyons. We're all honored to be in your presence, Chief Lyons, and I've learned a great deal from you over the years. We have been at the same meetings going on for decades, and also, I like to hear you talk. I like the way you talk. You know, it just kind of puts me in a soothing state. And there's a deep well of wisdom there. Dr. Rick Clugston and Michel Gerard, thank you. These two, as you will hear from yourself, and as many of you already know, are so distinguished and such tremendous leaders. I look forward to hearing from them. Okay, I am going to try to cover a little bit of ground in a short period of time so that we can get on with the entirety of this panel and then go to your questions. Just this morning or yesterday, NASA announced that this summer just about to conclude is by far the hottest summer in the history of global record keeping. Tomorrow, NOAA will announce the same thing. The Japanese agency did the same thing this year. When it is concluded, the odds are now 99. I don't know the specific statistic, but the scientists are telling me that it's virtually certain that this year will be the hottest year ever measured by a considerable margin, absent some extremely unusual downturn in temperatures in the final couple of months of the year. And so it's just more evidence, and every morning and every evening on the television news, it's like, as I've said on other occasions, a nature hike through the book of Revelation. Just this morning, the incredible fires in the west and the downpours in the southwest, and the list is quite a long one, and I'm not going to take much time, but it's just a reminder that we are gathering at a moment in time when the signs of dramatic change and both peril and promise for our future are all around us, and most of us here know that very, very well. Most of us know that on this day we will, as a species, put another 110 million tons of heat-trapping gas into the thin shell of atmosphere surrounding the planet. The cumulative amount now traps as much extra heat energy as would equal the energy released by 400,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every 24 hours. And so we have to change course, and we have to, what was your phrase, Oren? Value change for survival. So let me say a few words about how the title of this session is, of course, discussion of the transformation of our legal, economic, and cultural structures to mitigate climate change and address its root causes. So all of those structures are structures that we develop. We have inherited many of them, but we have the duty to revisit the structures within which we live our lives and make an assessment as to whether they need to be updated in light of new knowledge, whether or not they are still serving their original purposes or not. And where value is concerned, how do we recognize what is valuable? How do we see what is valuable? Because looking is not the same as seeing. And the Proverbs 29, verse 18, where there is no vision, the people perish. One of the best known quotations from my faith tradition, vision is in some translations read as a revelation or prophecy, and perish in some translations is read as the people will run wild into misery. But where there is no vision, people perish. So I'd like to tell three quick stories about vision, really to use it as a metaphor for comprehension, for understanding, for recognition, for revelation, for the ability to see our true circumstances. And let's talk about how we see value. Most all of us during the years of our schooling learned about light that we used to see, and learned that it was part of a spectrum of energy, and it's often depicted as an electromagnetic spectrum, usually with a long horizontal box with the different wavelengths of electromagnetic energy, and light is a very thin slice of that spectrum, and gamma rays are the shortest, and radio waves are among the longest, and infrared and ultraviolet and microwaves and all the different wavelengths in between. And visible light, the radiation that gives us the ability to see, that empowers our vision in the physical sense, is less than 0.1% of the total spectrum. And yet, because 70% of our brain is devoted to the optical systems, and since we know that all other sighted people operate the same way, we tend to assume that what we see in the visible light portion of the spectrum is all we need to worry about. That's it. As Abraham Maslow, the great psychologist of value, once said in an aside, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And so we see with our eyes, and we feel safe in ignoring the rest of that spectrum. I had the unusual experience of working for 8 years in the White House and beginning each morning with an hour-long briefing from the intelligence community, which, as you may have read, collects information from all parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. And God bless them, and thank them for keeping us safe. I'm not going to divert into a cul-de-sac there, but the picture presented with the benefit of ultraviolet and infrared and signals intelligence and all the rest, was a far more complete and accurate picture. So when we look at what is valuable in our economic activities and the way we live our lives, we use certain assumptions about what is worth seeing. What do we see? To change Maslow's aphorism slightly, if the only tool we use for measuring value is a price tag, then those things that do not have price tags attached can seem as if they have no value. And so we look at the sum total of human activities and the activities in our own lives, and we focus on those things that are easily monetized, that have price tags, that we can calculate and add up and keep track of on ledgers and Bloomberg screens. Second story. There is a video available on the internet, one of the I don't know how many hundreds of millions now, and I would dare say that many of you here have seen it. If you're in the investment world, you probably have. It involves about a dozen people, half of them in white t-shirts and half of them in black t-shirts, and they are passing a basketball or medicine ball from one to the other. Who's seen this video? A few of you, okay, maybe 20%. The rest, I'm going to ruin it for the rest of you, but you can look it up on the internet. And it is used by a psychologist as a little test. And it's about, I don't know, 90 seconds or 2 minutes long. And he says at the beginning, your task is to count the number of times someone in a white t-shirt touches this ball. And so they're milling around and they're passing the ball from one to the other with their different t-shirts. And everyone's looking and counting, and when the video concludes, the question comes, how many, what's your answer, how many? And some say 16, 17, 15, 18. And the moderator says, well, the correct answer is, I forget, but 17. Now, did anyone see the gorilla? And in the many times this test has been run, approximately 90% of the people who watch this do not notice that in the middle of this cluster of people passing the ball around, a large person dressed in a gorilla suit walks right into the middle of the circle, turns to face the camera, and beats the chest of the gorilla suit, and then turns and walks out the other side of the circle. And they replay that portion of the video in slow motion, and people are astonished that they did not see the gorilla in the middle of the circle. Now, there's no magic involved in that. There is a specific psychological phenomenon known, I'm told, as selective attention. And the phenomenon it describes is connected to the deeper truth that we don't actually see with our eyes. We look with our eyes. We see with our comprehension. We see with our brains. Vision, in that sense, occurs when our consciousness registers the shape and meaning of the patterns that are filtered from the visible light spectrum through the optical systems and recognized in our consciousness. If we are so intently focused on a select phenomena that we are paying all of our attention to, we literally do not see the gorilla in the middle of the room. Here's the third and final story about vision. One of Karenna's sisters, Karenna has a sister who was also, like Karenna, a great lacrosse player, and a brother who was a great lacrosse player. This was the sister who was a soccer player. And about 15 years ago, I took her to the top of a volcano, a dormant or extinct volcano in Hawaii on the Big Island, Mauna Kea, where they have telescopes. And I know it's the subject of an ongoing controversy there, but what was at that point the most powerful telescope ever built, the KECS, K-E-C-K-S, because it's plural, there are two of them, part of the same system. The most powerful telescopes funded by a donor who insisted that they push the limits of what was then technologically possible, and they incorporated all of these new innovations, but one of them struck my attention. The two telescopes are identical. They focus on the same object. They're about 100 yards apart. When they focus on a supernova 100 million light years away, that separation of 100 yards makes all the difference in the amount of meaning that can be harvested from seeing that supernova. That small distance in between one perspective and another. So when the Iroquois nation became a democracy, and when our founders, with many sources of wisdom at their disposal, chose to become a representative democracy, we did so because of conceptions of justice, but there was also a very practical reason. Some contemporary thinkers refer to the wisdom of crowds. And indeed, there is a very deep meaning in the wisdom of crowds. One of the professors at Columbia Business School teaches a course that was once taught by Warren Buffett's mentor, I'm blanking on his name now, pardon me? Graham, Ben Graham, who really was the teacher of Warren Buffett. And this current professor begins each semester with a glass bottle of jelly beans and passes it around to all of the students and asks each student to write down his or her estimate of how many jelly beans are in this jar. And the average guess is 50% wrong, either too many or too few. But the average of all of the guesses is almost always within a few beans of the correct answer. Why is that? It is connected to the principle that makes those two telescopes far more valuable being separated by a short distance. The value of diversity in the different life experiences and perspectives of those of different ages, ethnicities, genders, orientations, backgrounds, and all of the other differences we could cite, enable us as a group of people to understand a great deal more about any phenomena that we are trying to see. The United States of America rose to the position of being respected by the community of nations more than any other in the 20th century, in part because we made better decisions over an extended period of time than others, because in turn we harvested the wisdom of crowds by using the brilliant software, if you will, of the US Constitution to regularly collect and process the collective wisdom of what the American people were seeing. And yes, finally we added women, and yes, I hope we will soon continue removing the restrictions that are preventing so many African Americans still from voting. And again, that's not my subject today, but our diversity is an enhancement of our ability to see. Let me close by parlaying this to a specific way that we now try to see what is valuable in the economy. In 1937, a great economist named Simon Kuznets created a new system for measuring value called GDP, gross domestic product. And many of you know the problems with gross domestic product. But in 1937, the creator of GDP, who was honored many times for his invention, said, please don't use this as a guide for national economic policy. And a few years later, at the famous Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, as the post-World War II order was being put in place, it was enshrined as the way we guided economic policy. Why did its inventor say don't use it? Because it leaves out, among other things I'll mention four. Externalities is the word you've heard, most often in connection with negative externalities like pollution. But the point is, we see value in a way that blinds us to the economic and other impact of those 110 million tons of heat-trapping gas pollution that we're putting into the atmosphere today. And the other negative externalities, the consequences of irresponsible fracking, you can form your own list. But what's not often noted as well is that it blinds us to the value of positive externalities. What's a positive externality? If a community invests in mental health care or child services, it is logged as an expense, but the benefits that come rolling back into the community over the years ahead are not measured. We are blind to them. We don't see them. Secondly, it does not measure the depletion of natural resources, like, for example, underground fresh water supplies, as Betty was telling us at the lunch session. How do we put a value on water? Well, we don't. We don't officially. It is not measured. Clean air, a climate balance that supports the flourishing of humankind, the beauty of a sunset, and all of the other examples that you can find. We do not measure the depletion of the topsoil along with the groundwater. Third, it does not measure inequality. Inequality in incomes or net worths. So that if we have a 3% increase in GDP, that is cause for universal celebration, save perhaps by those who notice that the median income goes down 3%. And if the distributional effects of the choices we make lead to this gross, obscene accumulation of income and net worth at the very top of the income scale and depresses the incomes of others, we don't see it. We don't measure it. We don't see that gorilla either. So I'll conclude with this. Why don't we change it? Well, part of it is we have the so-called Qwerty problem. You know, the keyboard, Qwerty, on the keyboard on the typewriter. Perhaps most of you know this story. That was designed that way because the first typewriters had metal keys that would jam, and so they purposely designed a keyboard to make it as difficult as possible to type fast. And now we can change the keyboards in an instant with the electronic systems, but we don't do it because I and most of you learned to type the old way, and it's a hassle. to change that. So we go hunting for keys with the little finger, and we make a lot of mistakes. And so GDP is a QWERTY issue, but it's more than that as well. There are vested interests who like the current system. But in order to see what we are doing, we have to make changes in the instruments we use to extend our vision, in the ways we focus our concentration, in the choices we make about what we pay attention selectively to. Finally, I am an optimist. I don't deal in false hope. Much damage has been done, and consequences will be suffered. But there is reason for legitimate hope that we can still construct a future that will avoid the worst that would otherwise befall us, and that will give us the joy of being a generation of people alive in this extraordinary time that constructs a legitimate basis for telling our children and grandchildren that better days are ahead, because we have seen what we must do. Every cause that has a moral basis, and yes, this is a moral issue and not a political issue. It is unfortunately also a political issue, but it is fundamentally a moral issue. And every great cause, whether abolition or women's suffrage or GLBTQ rights or the civil rights movement, every one of them has begun to succeed and move toward victory when it was resolved into a binary choice between what is right and what is wrong. The great challenge is seeing through the clutter, through all of these institutions and law and culture and economics and all the rest, all the way, whether it's 100 million light years away, to the simple choice, what is right and what is wrong. We have right on our side, and therefore we shall prevail.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Michel Gerard. Michel Gerard is the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Law School. He teaches courses on environmental law, climate change law, and energy regulation, and is director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. He's also chair of the faculty of Columbia University's Earth Institute. A prolific writer in environmental law and climate change, Gerrard twice received the Association of American Publishers' Best Law Book Award for works on environmental law and brownfields. He's written or edited 11 books. He has also served on numerous boards and organizations. He has, since 1986, been an environmental law columnist for the New York Law Journal. He's taught and lectured all over the world. And he's been very generous to me and to Union, to the Center for Earth Ethics, and I actually graduated from Columbia Law School, so I'm especially excited about this partnership. And I have a friend who works there who said that many of the students describe him as the smartest person on the Columbia Law School faculty. So thank you so much for being with us, Professor Gerard.
Thanks very much, Karenna. Karenna has asked me to talk about the specific changes in law and policy that the United States can and should adopt in order to address the climate issue, and also to what extent are they consistent or inconsistent with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. A continuation of the current climate change patterns on our current path would make it impossible to achieve several of the UN goals: ending poverty, ending hunger, universal access to safe drinking water, sustainable economic growth, resilient infrastructure and human settlements, sustainable oceans, and much more. Business as usual emissions are incompatible with all of these and with more. So is our current pattern of economic development, which is too often focused on centralized, dirty energy. But the one UN development goal that is explicitly about climate change is Goal 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. So the answer to the question about what can and should be done in the U.S. in the immediate future to take urgent action on climate change and its impacts depends on drawing a line between what could be done with the help of Congress and what could be done without or maybe in spite of Congress. Congress has not passed a major new environmental law since 1990. In the past quarter century, we've had many developments in technology, science, economics, and many other things, but the laws we have, the statutes on the books, are frozen in time because of an ever-growing partisan divide. Both houses of Congress are now controlled by a party that has been hijacked by a faction that denies the very existence of climate change and that has declared as one of its core objectives perpetuating the profligate use of one of the most dangerous minerals on the planet, coal. If we had a Congress that cared at all about the future or about the rest of the world or even about its own coastal cities, the first policy it would adopt would be a price on carbon. We cannot put a price on many of the best things in the world, but we can put a price on many of the worst things in the world. A price on carbon would reverberate through every part of the economy and fundamentally alter patterns of both production and consumption. If companies could no longer dump their carbon into the atmosphere for free, if they lost this enormous subsidy of being able to offload their negative impacts, their externalities on everyone else, we would see a massive shift in our patterns of energy use. We would also see a rush of technological innovation. With a lot of companies and with too many people, if you grab their wallets, their values will follow. This price on carbon could be imposed through a carbon tax or through a cap-and-trade system or maybe through some other mechanism. But in the current atmosphere dominated by Fox News, talk radio, and big fossil fuel money, Republicans don't dare even hint at that idea, regardless of what they may personally think. There is some talk behind closed doors of a macro solution that would involve a hefty carbon tax, the proceeds of which would go back into the economy in the form of tax relief of various kinds to make it revenue neutral. It would also involve a cutback of some EPA regulations and the elimination of subsidies to both fossil and renewable energy sources. If the carbon tax were high enough and it were not riddled with exemptions, this might on a net basis yield the sorts of results we need. But the current political climate makes it impossible to discuss this out in the open. Without the help of Congress, it's hard to envision a national price on carbon, but there are many other things that can be done under existing law by a progressive administration, and some of them are being done. And I'll divide this between the decarbonization agenda and the resilience agenda. On top of the decarbonization agenda is the Clean Power Plan that President Obama and EPA have been advancing, aimed at reducing the use of coal-fired power plants. It's using a clunky, difficult section of the Clean Air Act, but if it survives the formidable political and legal challenges that it's facing, it will make a significant difference. Energy efficiency is the method with the single greatest potential to reduce greenhouse gases. It's central to the Clean Power Plan, and it can be advanced even further by yet more stringent appliance and vehicle standards, by a concerted effort to design our buildings and retrofit old buildings to be energy efficient as possible. Another thing that needs to be at the center of a decarbonization agenda is to stop fossil fuel extraction on federal lands or federally controlled lands. We've all heard about the carbon budget. It runs directly contrary to the carbon budget, to the need to limit the amount of fossil fuels that we ultimately put into the atmosphere, to be leasing out federally controlled lands for oil and gas and coal drilling. And it was very unfortunate that a couple of weeks ago the administration allowed oil drilling in the Arctic. We also need to continue and grow a massive program of building renewable energy sources. So that's the decarbonization agenda. With the resilience agenda, with coping with the climate change that's going to happen regardless of our best efforts, there are ample tools in the federal statutes to help do that. The National Environmental Policy Act, the federal statute that requires environmental impact statements for major federal actions, can be used, and by some agencies is being used, to look ahead to think about what will be the climate conditions, not only at the time that a project is built and opens, but at the end of its useful life. It makes no sense, for example, to build an airport runway that you want to be around in 40 years if you project that it will often be underwater in 40 years. So we do have a lot of existing legal tools to think about all those issues through in infrastructure planning, both at the federal level and the state level. We also have existing tools to be more rational in our planning of water use and water infrastructure, and we're seeing in California the very negative consequences of not sufficiently anticipating that. And we also have to anticipate changes in agricultural patterns that are going to be compelled by future climate conditions. One of the most important things that we need to anticipate is the large numbers of people who will be displaced around the world as a result of climate change. We've all been witnessing in horror the situation in the Mediterranean and in Europe with untold numbers of millions of people who are displaced and are not welcomed in new homes. The number of people who are displaced now by the horrible conflicts in Syria and Eritrea and elsewhere is only a fraction of the number of people who later in the century will be displaced as a result of climate change unless we adopt very, very serious methods of decarbonization of the global economy. But given that even with that, there will be large numbers of people displaced. We need to start planning for that, and I believe it is the moral obligation of each of the major countries that contributed in a large way to the growth of greenhouse gas emissions and to the load of it in the atmosphere to take in a very significant portion of these people. Under one calculation, the United States is responsible for about 27% of the greenhouse gases that are now in the atmosphere. If there are, to pick a round number, 100 million people who toward the end of the century are going to be displaced by climate change, that means that we should take in about 27 million of those people. Now, clearly that is nowhere in the current political discourse of the United States. But I think we do need to begin thinking about that, and the religious community, I think, bears a special ability to address those issues. We also need to put up our fair share toward the $100 billion commitment embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals. But all of the above actions, all of these actions that can be taken under our existing statutory framework could be shut down overnight by the wrong president. Many of the candidates have vowed to reverse all EPA and other actions to fight climate change. That cannot be allowed to happen. And this highlights the importance of electoral politics and of the 2016 election. It is an enduring national and global tragedy that this gentleman did not become the president. For 8 years, our environmental policies went in exactly the wrong direction. It's an open question whether the planet will recover from the lost time. But the single most important thing that all of us could do now for the sake of the Earth and for all of the values that are at the heart of this important conference is to make sure that America does not make that kind of mistake again but instead sends to the White House a man or a woman who will fully embrace and meet the climate challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, my pleasure to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Rick Clugston. Rick Clugston is the co-director of the Association of University Leaders for a Sustainable Future and directs the Sustainable Development Programs of Forum 21. From 2009 to 2012, Rick directed the Earth Charter Project at the Center for Environmental and Sustainability Education at Florida Gulf Coast University. From 1989 to 2009, Rick served as executive director of the Center for Respect of Life and Environment in Washington, D.C., where he assisted religious and academic institutions in transforming their teaching and practices to support strong sustainability. Rick was publisher and editor of Earth Ethics, Evolving Values for an Earth Community, and the deputy editor of the International Journal of Sustainability in Higher Education. Rick worked at the University of Minnesota as a faculty member in the College of Human Ecology and later as a strategic planner in academic affairs. We are so proud to claim Rick now at the Center for Earth Ethics, where he currently leads our global affairs and sustainability programs, and he has donated a beautiful library of books on religion and ecology and spirituality and earth-honoring faith and all these wonderful topics as they've evolved over the years that he's been doing this. Thank you so much for that and for the Earth Ethics Journal copies that we have. And welcome to the stage, Rick. Thank you.
Thank you, Karenna. It's a delight to be working for the Center for Earth Ethics and actually to see much of the things that I was working on in the 90s and early 2000s being sort of brought together again. And I think one of the things that you'll see or are seeing in the program today is all of the dimensions that Earth Ethics actually connects to, and how part of the task is how do we bring all of this together, both into some coherence as a intellectual framework, but also as a basis for a broad social movement, building the civil will to actually change the political will. The central question I want to focus on really is, what is development for? And by development, I mean economic development, personal development, sustainable development. I had the pleasure, when was it, 1992, of flying to Rio de Janeiro with Chief Lyons, and then we took a taxi, and we went out to this great gathering of indigenous people. Yeah, it was just wonderful. A giant, a major big, I don't know what you would call it, cover hut sort of roof, and all indigenous people from all over the world gathered. It was on the grounds of a mental hospital. Do you remember that? I don't know what that means. Also, at the Earth Summit, I remember then Senator Gore and then Senator Paul Wellstone doing this wonderful rally around the Gloria in the People's Gathering Place. And out of the Earth Summit came Agenda 21, which was an integrated agenda for sustainable development. People were very excited about it, thought that transformative change was just around the corner. We had national Agenda 21s, we had Sustainable America, we had local Agenda 21s. And then in the 90s, as free market accelerated and all sorts of forces came into being, a lot of that faded away. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, more than 150 world leaders, heads of state, are going to be gathering at UN headquarters on the 25th the day the Pope speaks to the United Nations General Assembly. And they're going to be engaged in a UN Sustainable Development Summit. And what that UN Sustainable Development Summit is going to do is it's going to adopt these 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the 169 targets that go along with those 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And in a way, what this is doing is it's replacing or incorporating the Millennium Development Goals, which were only 8 goals with 21 targets, incorporating the unfinished business of the Millennium Development Goals into a much broader framework, a much broader set. And I've been pretty involved with the NGO community, with the major groups work in this whole process. It really began in Rio Plus 20 years later after the Earth Summit. There was another conference in Rio de Janeiro, and that conference charged the UN with developing this whole set of sustainable development goals. And what these goals are to do, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, they're to deal with every country. The Millennium Development Goals were primarily focused on lifting up the people that were most ill-affected by poverty or lack of education or lack of gender equity, but it really didn't address any of the root causes or any of the drivers of our unsustainable economy. And so through these, what they called the open working groups, 13 open working groups, and then for the last 6 months, monthly intergovernmental negotiations, the 193 countries have agreed on these sustainable development goals and on the targets, and then the heads of state are going to approve that, we think, next weekend. But is this just another spin along the wheel? Is this Agenda 21 all over again in a new form? That's some kind of idealistic thing that will be affirmed but not implemented. I mean, I think that's always a central question. But I think unlike the processes that have gone into sustainable development up till this point in the UN context, there is a change. There is a sign of hope. And just watching the negotiations between these 193 permanent representatives, essentially ambassadors to the UN from these different countries, one, the process has been a lot more open to stakeholder input. And two, if the dominant rhetoric in all of these negotiations from these government representatives has been transformative change is needed, business as usual is not an option. So even at that level, the representatives of all these governments sort of get that we can't keep going down the same road. And one of the most interesting discussions in the intergovernmental negotiations was after they had essentially agreed on this final framework, there was sort of a gasp or a gulp of horror as they realized they were going to have to bring that home to their countries. And it was almost like a support group created in this negotiation frame where people were saying, we do need this change, now how on earth do we bring this home? And I think that's a huge challenge. What I wanted to do is just, the outcome is not perfect by far. And the danger in this new sustainable development agenda is that it's really just trying to bring the American consumption dream to everybody on the planet without crossing planetary boundaries. So you've got soon to be 9 billion people. You've got these planetary boundaries, only one Earth. How on earth can you do that? How on earth are you going to provide everybody with the good life defined the way we currently define it? And that still permeates a lot of the sustainable development goals. In point of fact, we probably need a pretty profound shift in our understanding of how much is enough and what a good life really is. And one of the main themes that we emphasize here at the Center for Earth Ethics is that we need to be guided by a lot of traditional, indigenous, other forms of wisdom from the deepest roots of our own various religious traditions. A lot of, I mean, the power of religion is that in many ways it's one of the only institutions that at least rhetorically hasn't gone along with the idea that whoever dies with the most stuff wins. You know, and it's much more about, there is something else to life than just accumulating more and more goods and services. So at the task ahead, it's been quite good. The financing for development, there's really these 4 pieces that have to be put together. One is what will be adopted this next weekend, the Sustainable Development Goals. The second piece is financing for development, and that's traditionally been a very different track. And the third piece is this high-level political forum, which is the new integrated governance structure that's being created by the UN to replace the Commission on Sustainable Development. The problem's been that economic development trumps everything, and then sustainable development's been way over on the side. But Ban Ki-moon actually is trying to bring all of that together and make sustainable development the centerpiece, both of all UN functioning, but also something adopted by all nation states. So I wanted to end with, sort of pick up on a few of the themes that have been brought up so far. What needs to change at that sort of global policy level? How do we actually implement these sustainable development goals? What kind of indicators? That'll be the big issue for the next year, is indicators. How do we translate these targets into actual measures that we hold people accountable for? So let's just mention a few possibilities. The first one's been brought up quite a bit, and that's coming up with an alternative to GDP. We need a genuine replacement of that as a bottom line indicator, driver. And there's a lot to draw on. That's gross national happiness, or genuine progress indicators, or buen vivir. A lot of places are developing these new frameworks of per people and planetary well-being, and it's essential that over the next year we kind of build something in. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be better than what we currently have. So alternatives to GDP. Second, and this has been brought up also, internalizing social and environmental costs into the pricing of goods and services. If we actually could create value chains that were based on true cost, and true cost would include both current social and environmental costs and the impact on future generations. So we need this effort to really come up with how do we actually do true cost pricing in the economic system. So that's number 2. And of course, it's correlated or integrated with getting rid of perverse subsidies. If indeed we got rid of all subsidies, for every $1 that goes to renewables, 9 goes to fossil fuels today. So that's a great platform to build libertarian and progressive agreement on, get rid of subsidies. Another one I think is the precautionary principle. The first definition of sustainable development that came from the Brundtland Commission report defines sustainable development as preserving for future generations resources, opportunities, not leaving them with less than we have today. That requires some way of thinking about the future, which is very impossible for the current economic financial system. Short-termism needs to be replaced by long-termism, and that's a restructuring of how we think of profitability in the corporate world. But also, the precautionary principle has been adopted in multiple international agreements, which basically means that the person that may damage people in the environment has to show that their drug, their pesticide, whatever it might be, is safe before it can be applied, like we do with the FDA and drugs. Precautionary principle. And then I think, to to end up, we need different governance structures developed within the United Nations system. There's a trusteeship council. And the trusteeship council was created after the UN was formed in 70 years ago, and it was to represent the interests of countries that weren't independent. They were still colonies. And so a lot of us have been talking about, can we create a trusteeship structure for future generations and the whole community of life? We need some kind of representation in the system like ombudspersons for future generations that represent those interests. And last, it's very much essential, and it's part of our program title, that we ensure that there is a just transition. Change is difficult. A lot of people are displaced or potentially ill-affected by a shift from fossil fuels to renewables. So it's important in whatever system gets created, cap and dividend, a fee and dividend that Jim Hansen's talking about, that dividend actually end up going to help people move to a new and better economy. So thank you very much, and I think it's going to be a great opportunity.
Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you to all these wonderful speakers. We have a few minutes for questions, and I promised myself I wasn't going to ask one myself because I do want to open it up, and actually before I do that, I want to also give the panelists a chance to ask each other questions, beginning with Chief Lyons. But I have to say I'm just thinking so much about the powerful content of today's discussions, and I'm thinking that we have this very exciting panel to end the day, which will be next, about disruption in some ways, solidarity with grassroots activism, but really when we look at these problems and we hear about these processes and our sort of precious democracy, and also the possibilities of the UN, but we've had a lot of people tell us the truth here today about how things really work. And we have a president who's a leader on climate in some ways, who's a progressive Democrat in some ways, who's drilling in the Arctic. And I think we need to talk about why that is the case. And it seems that because so many people have paid into this system for so long, and so many people are beholden to it, that the problem with the typewriter and the Qwerty problem is also about power and money and not just inertia. So I want to just put that in the background. I have a suspicion Reverend Fred Small will have a comment and a question that may speak to that. But before we open it up, I want to ask if Chief Lyons, would you have any question that you might like to ask or response? To any of the fellow speakers, and you might have a microphone down there.
Well, I have to think about that now. You don't very often get these big fish in a row. No, I think the question is fundamental and profound. Is how do we coalesce? How do we gain that union, that one mind, that power of coalition and direction? How do we energize that? How do we meet the issue that we have to meet? I see the compound of ice melting. It's not waiting. Ice is not waiting. It is going fast, and it's a compound, so that means it accelerates. And then we have human population. That's a compound. We have two major compounds going on at the same time. And if we don't meet the issues of equity, everybody fairness. You know, the 1%ers, that's so stupid. I don't know how people just don't understand that. You know, it's amazing to me. And how, you know, if you would take a leader out there speaking right now, Mr. Trump, and you ask him, Mr. Trump, what are you going to do about those fires? You know what he'd say? I'll put them out. And then he'd move on with no background, nothing, and people would accept that. I mean, that's where our problem is, that people accept such simplicity. So we've got to educate. So I'm wondering how we can do that better. How can we reach the people that need to understand?
I'll offer an answer to that. I think in order to solve the climate crisis, we have to solve the democracy crisis. Our democracy, obviously, it's in that big category of things that are easier said than done, but our democracy has been hacked, a computer term that means the operating system no longer serves its original purposes and has been diverted to serve the purposes who have commandeered control of the way it operates. I'll do this very briefly, but I feel very strongly about it. Referring back to that metaphor about harvesting the wisdom of crowds and thinking collectively in a clear way by learning from the diverse points of view and recognizing that are in our country, respecting all, and by recognizing that when representative democracy works the way it was designed to work, we have an excellent chance of really making very good decisions. How has this system been hacked and diverted to the purposes of others? When the American system was put in place, the information ecosystem was based on print technology, and it wasn't the ink and the keys and all of that. It was the architectural design of that ecosystem that gave very low entry, that presented very low entry barriers for individuals to join the group conversation, to go into the public square, if you will, gain access to the knowledge accessible there, and contribute their own, which was more often than not judged on the basis of perceived merit as judged by the collective masses of the literate who absorbed that wisdom. Never worked perfectly, but more often than not, it led to collective decision-making that guided the United States of America through lots of turmoil and trouble toward a steady realization of civil rights, gay rights, women's suffrage, you name it. But when that ecosystem was overturned by an information ecosystem based on television, broadcast, satellite, cable, all of a sudden entry barriers were raised. The Thomas Paine of today cannot get into the public square without paying lots of money to gatekeepers. And those who have enough money to pay the gatekeepers on a regular basis, large corporations, large special interest groups, wealthy and powerful, their voices dominate the noise of the public square. And Chief Lyon's voice is not heard as much as I would like it to be heard. Catherine Flower's voice is not heard as much as I would like it to be heard. And the perspectives of people in the 99% are not paid attention to as much as they should. So this is a big wheel turning, and I'll conclude with this. From an information ecosystem that fostered collective wisdom and the harvesting of crowds to one that was centralizing and favored wealthy and powerful individuals and institutions, we now have a third turn of that wheel toward an internet-based information ecosystem, and we are already seeing bloggers make a difference. We are already seeing facts re-emerge as a source of power alternative to wealth and force of arms. And there is some reason for legitimate hope that this momentum is shifting. The millennial generation is very different, not just a little different, but very different. And I think that the acceleration of the movement of the forms and practices and institutions of democracy into the digital world where individuals can take part offers the best chance of restoring our ability to make good collective judgments once again and see the real value of the choices that we make.
Thank you. I think we should go ahead and open it up so that we won't be too late for our final panel. So let's just do what we've been doing and go for 2 questions. Thank you, Reverend Small.
Thank you. My name is Fred Small. I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister in Massachusetts, and I just resigned my pulpit to work full-time for climate justice. My question is for Mr. Gore. The year 2000 was a long time ago, but if memory serves, the presidential election that year was very close. One of the reasons it was so close was that evangelical Christians turned out in large numbers and voted mainly for your opponent. Given Professor Gerrard's point about the importance of voting and understanding that, yes, we have to reduce the influence of big money in politics, what do you think it would take to motivate and organize people of faith to turn out in elections at the polling booth and vote with climate justice as a priority, with the same devotion and determination and success that the Christian right brought to their issues?
Well, I'm excited by the plans I've heard Karenna discuss. I don't want to get out ahead of her, but I think that the idea of offering a very massive continuing training program for any minister and faith leader to empower himself or herself with the facts about climate justice, about the solutions to the climate crisis can play a role. I would also say that I sometimes put maybe too much emphasis on the role of technology in our lives. I think it does. You know, someone said, I can't remember who to quote, but we make our tools and then our tools make us. There's a lot of wisdom in that. And these, just as the communications technology I was talking about, broadcast, is a centralizing, gatekeeping arrangement, the large centralized coal-burning electric generating stations are the same thing. They were felt to be natural monopolies. The only thing that should be a monopoly now is the distribution grid, and the sources of generating power and the information and other services related should not be part of that monopoly anymore. Here's why I'm mentioning this. 2 weeks from now, I'm doing a training session in Miami. And by the way, the discussion of sea level rise throughout the next century is already present in Miami. As some of you know, in the highest of the high tides, many of their streets flood regularly now. Norfolk, Virginia, the largest naval base in the world, is going to have to be relocated because of sea level rise. And that's not even to mention Bangladesh and Vietnam and all of the cities in Asia, South America, North America, and Africa. West Africa is a particular risk. So in this session in Miami, one of the speakers is a woman named Debbie Dooley. She was one of the founders of the National Tea Party movement, and she is now head of the Atlanta Tea Party. Few of you may know this story. What made me think of it is the Christian Coalition, one of the very conservative, evangelically oriented Christian groups, has now just joined this coalition that Debbie Dooley has put together. She was used to getting, in the Atlanta Tea Party, these regular requests for support from the Koch brothers group, American Legislative Exchange Council, and the request came in, okay, we need to put a tax on solar panels on people's roofs. And she had just put solar panels on her roof, and she said, well, I don't understand why, and they tried to explain it, and she looked up at her roof and said, no, I don't think so. And so the Atlanta Tea Party joined with the Sierra Club and formed a new group called the Green Tea Party. And now that the Christian Coalition has joined, it's the Green Tea Coalition, and they like the idea of having solar panels on their roofs that are affordable, and solar gardens, community solar gardens, so that the instinctive and in some ways very American distrust of centralized power is not aimed only at the government. It's also aimed at monopolies and large institutions that they feel impinge on individual freedom. I really think that there is a tremendous source of hope in the incredibly rapid spread of solar photovoltaic panels all over the world. The fastest deploying nation in the world is Bangladesh. We are seeing a meteoric rise. In South America last year, a 370% increase, a similar increase this year, because the cost is coming below the cost of coal-generated power. So I think that the cluster of issues that has kept evangelicals disproportionately locked into a conservative Republican coalition that in the main serves the interests of the 1% is weakening with these changes in communications, with the internet, in energy, in electricity generation, with the solar PV. So I'm sort of temperamentally inclined to be optimistic. All of us who work in this struggle have an internal battle between hope and despair that we don't often acknowledge. But be of good cheer and do not weary in well-doing.
Thank you.
Okay. I just want to say, I know, Reverend Small, that you plan the Creation Coalition, which will go even further in pursuit of that mission, and hot off the presses is your business card, creationcoalition.org, for anyone who's interested in learning more about those efforts.
Thank you. My name is Andrea Psoris, and I'm a member of the New York Society of Security Analysts. I'm a financial sector analyst, and I'm based in New York. I serve on this committee, however, called what had been the Socially Responsible Investing Committee, and we changed our name to the Sustainable Investing Committee, which concerned me because the first name was, I thought, perfectly fine. So I'm curious, however, because when this new name, sustainability, which is a nice, pleasant name, and it's somewhat amorphous, so it so gathers up the environmental ESG, which is the governance, and so thank you. And so, however, my experience as a bank analyst, which ordinarily wouldn't bring me into things like understanding the technology that Monsanto uses, and Monsanto wants to claim itself that it's attempting to achieve sustainability goals, and things like the Global 2000 Agenda, which was spoken very well of today, is a population reduction goal. And companies like Monsanto have a great deal of power, sadly, with regard to the ability to get its toxic chemicals deregulated, its unsafe grains deregulated. And some of my questions to my peers and colleagues are, well, how's the U.S. achieving, as a signatory to Global 2000, the population reduction characteristic? And this is seemingly a big question mark. So my question to the panel is, who among our colleagues is brave enough, or as a scientist and someone who can do the critical thinking, to connect the dangers in the terrible herbicides, of which Dow Chemical makes 2,4-D, it's a dioxin-based herbicide. EPA regulation is so extraordinarily flimsy that the amount of dioxin that's now allowed in the environment by the herbicides that they're using on the grains, and these grains are quite toxic. They actually hurt the soil, and it takes a fair amount of time once the farmers go into non-GMO growing. So I've also seen the spike in the cancer rates. There's a significant amount of information that there seems to be a failure on the part of the public health system. And speaking about broken government, Mr. Gore, thank you very much, because this speaks to this point. So because I think it's really going to take some courage, but so among the scientist community, who can make the connection between the harms, because the organic seed farmers and some of the organic, but who's willing to make that connection? And my next part of my question is the military contractors, which are all big government friends, make space-based technology that can alter the weather patterns. So when they can do the weather weapons, Senator John Glenn and Rep. Kucinich were attempting to get space-based weapons, things like the weather weapons, banned. These can alter even the climate and change the temperatures and things. And so who among our scientific community is willing to start to, and I'm not at all ridiculing the issues about global warming, I'm saying that there's other deleterious influences. So who's willing to do that too?
I'll take a quick stab at that. I wouldn't worry too much about the weather modification stories that you may have read. There are these wacky proposals called geoengineering, which should be guarded against, but there are a lot of people worrying about that. On the seed technology, that's a whole other conversation, but let me tell you what I think is the main problem. Research and development and scientific work on enhancing plant genetics, enhancing the ability to feed the world, is now overly dominated by corporations that are seeking profits. Okay, they can seek profits, but that shouldn't set the public's agenda for the work that's done. There are places that can enhance crop yields, but they're not being funded because they're public goods. And it comes back to something I was saying earlier. Of all those problems with GDP, one of the most sinister is that positive externalities are not measured and not recognized. So we have a default position in the United States and in a lot of other countries, the austerity agenda is connected to this, that devalues and assigns a value of 0, in many cases, to public investments that create public goods. So GDP goes up, and we have more pollution, more depletion of natural resources, more inequality, and a chronic underinvestment in helping to feed the world, in developing renewable energy and better batteries. What percentage of global GDP goes to research and development of renewable energy and efficiency? Answer, 0.002%. That is officially insane. We have to get over this idea that it's wrong to invest in public goods, whether it's national parks or better schools or a better health care that serves all people or protection of the environment. This is not just political rhetoric. It is now a change of value for survival. So there's a lot more that I'm sure all of us would want to say in connection with that. But I'll just close for my part by saying I really do think that connecting these great questions to the faith traditions where people look for the answer to the question of what's right and what's wrong is maybe the central turning point beyond which we have a much better chance of winning these struggles.
Should I say something?
Also, I think you're seeing in Europe now, particularly in the Netherlands, the development of the research base that demonstrates that often it's local, more permaculture type agriculture systems that are more productive. So a lot of it, what we also need to do is fund a lot more demonstration that these alternative local organic systems actually are productive in a much better way to feed the world, especially if we can incorporate these other dimensions of negative and positive externalities that come from that kind of rich local community and honest work instead of manipulation.
I'd like to let you know that we haven't been just sitting by the roadside. I'm talking about the Haudenosaunee. We have an enterprise called Plantagon. Plantagon is a greenhouse designed for cities, and we've been working in Asia in particular. We're trying very hard to get one up here in the U.S., but it's vertical farming. We've solved the problem of getting sun to layers, and so the first one is going up in Linköping, south of Stockholm right now. It's about, I think, going to be maybe 12 stories, which is kind of small for what we're talking about. Would produce probably 500 metric tons of food in 1 year. It's highly productive. It's 24 hours. We protect the plant. We use minimal water, and we reach to where you're going to have very huge problems in just planting and just getting your fields out there. Right now, the farmers will tell you we're having a heck of a time to get our crops in. It's either too wet or you dry out by the end of the year and your crops die in the field. So that's all part of this global warming. It's all part of the process. But Plantagon is out there, and the innovation in the structure itself is that 10% of our company belongs to the public. 10% is owned by the public, and it's a nonprofit. And also that you can go online and you can buy a share in it, but you can only buy one. You cannot buy 10 or 100. And so it stymies the investor who wants the control. And so this enterprise is moving very fast, and it's going to try to meet some of the issues that you're going to be facing. And it's interesting to me that one of the most traditional systems of governance in the world, which is the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, is also #1 in the advance in technology.
Well, let's follow up right after. I want to say thank you all so much. I wanted to note that the spirit of that last question very much reminded me of something from the Union Theological Seminary canon, which is Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech Beyond Vietnam, Breaking the Silence Beyond Vietnam, which he made at the invitation of Union in 1967, and talked about the triplet evils of militarism, racism, and materialism, which he also includes poverty. And it's just a visionary speech that I think we can all draw inspiration from as we look at how all this intersects. The final session is so exciting, and we'll let it go over as much as need be into the reception hour, because you'll have as much fun in that session as you would at the reception. I encourage everyone to stay. Maybe we'll just take a moment for these, a big round of applause for these speakers and our next to come up.
My friend, just so you know, my friend, I already have a cup. Perfect. Would you like some water? Yes, please. I just want to use another cup.
I didn't know who was yelling, my friend.
Yeah.